Welcome everyone to Andrew Head's dissertation talk. Great to see such a great turnout. We have 52 people on the call right now. My name is Björn Hartman, and along with Marty Hurst, I co-advised Andrew on his path through our PhD program. Andrew came to Berkeley from the University of Pittsburgh, but his ties to Berkeley and to BID, the Berkeley Institute of Design, actually predate his arrival on campus. Because at Pitt, he was introduced to HCI research by a BID alum, Jingtao Wang. As an undergrad, he worked on language learning and games. Once at Berkeley, he focused on the topic of helping programmers deal with the information complexity they're faced with when learning new APIs. Today, you'll hear about his core research on program distillation, or the process of condensing code to a concise, didactically useful format for the purpose of sharing it with others. But Andrew's research during his PhD was broader than that. He also worked on generating explanations of code automatically, on using program synthesis to help teachers scale their efforts in large online courses. He studied API documentation, and beyond tools for programmers, on measuring human development with satellite imagery. For many of these projects, Andrew pulled together incredible teams, other faculty, postdocs, grad students and undergraduates here at Berkeley, as well as researchers at Microsoft and Google. When Andrew starts a project, there's a high chance he'll end up winning some kind of award. His research was recognized with either a Best Paper Award or a nomination 4 times at VLHCC 2015 and at CHI 2018, 2019, and 2020. For his work, he was also awarded an NDSEG fellowship. When not leading his own projects, he frequently pitched in to help other students on their thesis research, from digital fabrication, embedded systems debugging, to studies of data scientists. He's also been a great teacher, taking on the challenging task of teaching CS160 to dozens of undergraduates in a very intensive 4-day-a-week summer format. Andrew's turned into a really amazing, well-rounded scholar with terrific taste for interesting research questions. Faculty know a student is ready to graduate when the student starts teaching them about research ideas and methods. And that's been my experience for at least the past year. I was there to learn from Andrew instead of the other way around. He's got a bright future ahead of him in academia, and I'll leave it to him to tell you about his next career move. But for now, please join me in a virtual hand clap, if you can find the button in your Zoom interface, for Andrew Head.
Well, thank you so much, Bjorn. That's a wonderfully flattering introduction. And thank you everyone for coming in and joining me today. Really, I'm very excited to be able to share this exciting research direction that I've had the privilege of working on for the course of the last few years. So let's get started. My research is about a topic called interactive program distillation. And the logistics of this talk are, first, some of you might be interested in seeing me while we go through these slides. And so if you are, there should be some little Zoom window floating around on one of your desktops. If you drag it into the upper right corner of your screen, I promise there won't be anything too important in that upper right corner. If you're seeing a lot of people's faces, then you just click on the second button at the top of that little Zoom window, and then that will show just my face. This talk is timed to go until about 10:55 or so, and then we have time set aside from 10:55 to 11:15 for questions. But of course, just stay as long as you wish, and you can. The way that we'll be doing questions this time is we'll be accepting questions through chat throughout the entirety of this talk. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end when Bjorn will be facilitating them. Great, okay. So much of the learning that a programmer does is in informal settings outside of a classroom. As a young programmer myself, I was very interested in game programming, and I learned how to program games from a tutorial kind of like the one that you see on the screen. This tutorial is kind of like a set of IKEA instructions for programming the game of Super Mario World. And there's a few different components of these instructions. First, you have these written explanations of what the programmer should be doing. These written instructions describe how to assemble together a set of code snippets into a functional program. And then these tutorials will also include expected results so that a programmer can check their work and make sure they're on the right track. This particular tutorial is very cool because it embeds a version of Mario at each step in the tutorial that you can actually play around with. For instance, check that you have indeed added the dragon coin in this section after this step of the tutorial. Now, producing these documents can be rather challenging. This particular tutorial includes 41 snippets and 22 outputs. And in order to produce it, an author is going to start with a single program of their own and have to go through these 4 steps in order to produce it. Where first, they'll select code of interest from their source program that they want to share. They'll simplify that code, transforming it so that it can be more readable. They'll sequence it, splitting it into a series of snippets that build on top of each other in order to build up this program. And then they'll supplement it with rich explanations and outputs, where there's some gotchas in this process. For instance, the outputs are generated from all of the snippets that appear above those snippets in the tutorial. And it's through these 4 tasks that an author ends up producing a sample program. And while the process looks linear in this slide, it's actually iterative. So an author might do a little bit of selection, a little bit of simplifying, split it into some snippets, go back, select a little bit more code, supplement it with text, and so on and so forth. This is a complex task that currently just doesn't have tool support for programmers. This dissertation is about something called program distillation, which is about helping authors turn their existing programs into sample programs with tool assistance. So this brings me to the thesis of the work, which is that authors can transform existing programs into sample programs more efficiently and flexibly when they're aided by interactive tools that help them select, simplify, supplement, and sequence code. And all of the work that I've been doing across this dissertation has been in order to support 3 implicit claims to this thesis. First, when an author is working with a distillation tool, they have access to interactive functionality that can help them select, simplify, supplement, and sequence code. Second, these interactions can be supported by existing proven program analysis techniques. And third, they lead to a more efficient and flexible authoring experience. Throughout this talk, I'll be developing this thesis by considering 3 different projects that we worked on over the course of the last 3 years, called CodeScoop, Torii, and Gathering Tools, which all support this task of distilling existing programs into sample programs. CodeScoop helps programmers turn existing programs into short code snippets by helping them interactively and iteratively select and simplify code. Torii helps programmers convert their existing programs into these step-by-step tutorials, focusing on the task of helping programmers supplement their code with outputs and explanations, and also sequence them, splitting them into snippets. And of course, the dynamic combination of this project is the ability to do simultaneous supplementing and sequencing during this iterative development, this iterative messy distillation process. And Gathering Tools is a distillation tool in an entirely new type of code editor. That code editor is called a computational notebook, and the tool helps authors select and supplement their code in order to make cleaner notebooks that they can share with others. Across these projects, we cover all 4 of the different types of interactive functionalities of distillation tools. I'm going to start with CodeScoop, where we'll do the deepest dive of the 3 projects. We'll talk about each of the 3 claims of the interactions developed, the program analyses that support them, and our evidence that they lead to a more efficient and flexible authoring experience. Then the ones after that, we'll talk about too, because they're cool projects with really cool interactive functionality and plugged together into this larger framework of how you can build an effective distillation tool. But once we have the primer from CodeScoop, we can move a little bit quickly through the other 2. So let's start with CodeScoop. The motivating question behind CodeScoop was, how can tools make it easier for programmers to share short snippets based on their existing code? The snippets that programmers often share over chat, online, in documentation are usually concise and self-contained, and yet their own personal code, which contains interesting patterns that they might want to share, is detailed and personal. And so there's a need to distill one's own programs into these snippets if one wants to share them in an effective way. To be able to better understand what it looked like to distill snippets and how tools could provide support, we started by conducting a formative study where we observed 12 programmers as they created snippets out of their existing programs. This is the workspace of one of the programmers in the study. And you can see that it's pretty complex. There's a whole bunch of different windows conveying a bunch of different types of information. To orient you to this space, this window on the left is a code editor where they were building up a code sample. And this editor on the right is the one where their existing program was. So there were pitfalls related to selection and simplification as authors were building up this code snippet. When they were transcribing text from the existing program into their sample, sometimes they made transcription errors. Sometimes they forgot to copy code over into the code snippet. Other programmers took a different tack, taking an existing program and removing code from it until they ended up with a minimal program, but this could also be time-consuming and tedious. In addition, when authors were simplifying their own programs in order to make them more readable, sometimes they would inadvertently change the behavior of the program or introduce bugs. These observations led us to hypothesize that a distillation tool could help out with the creation of snippets if they provide two types of functionality. First, they help authors select subsets of code both quickly and completely. And second, they help programmers make simplifications to their code without introducing errors in the process. We ended up designing a mixed initiative, and by that I mean an interactive process where a programmer worked in dialogue with their code editor. We developed a mixed initiative interaction for extracting snippets from existing code, where it had 6 basic steps. First, the author selects a pattern that they want to share from their own code. Then the editor creates a snippet, which is shown just side by side with the original source program, bringing all of this information into the same workspace. And then the editor helps the author select code by flagging errors, suggesting code fixes by including additional code from the original program, suggests simplifications to that code. For instance, maybe I could replace this num pages variable with a value that it took on during the program's execution. And it can also make automated fixes in places where there's really no authoring choice to be made. Really, some clerical work should be taken care of on the behalf of the programmer. We needed a new name to describe this type of interaction. So let's imagine we're looking at this program where there's a database transaction where data is fetched and saved into this book data structure. If you consider this code to be this delicious ice cream, what we wanted to do was develop a tool that helped an author scoop that code from the program and serve it up as a delicious snippet for someone else. So we called the interaction Scoop and the tool CodeScoop. Looking at this from an abstract perspective, scooping is something that is best seen as kind of like a foil to program slicing, where program slicing is this formal technique, this formal analysis technique in software engineering, where it lets a programmer select a line of code from a program, and then the program slicer finds all other lines in the program that that particular line depends on. But program slicers have to make these decisions about which lines are probably going to be relevant or not, which usually leads the slicer to either being overly conservative or missing lines of interest. And this is where CodeScoop comes in. With program scooping, an author chooses a line of interest, and then where there are interesting decision points, they can choose which lines to include, which ones not to include, and they can also interact with this support that allows them to simplify some of that code by swapping out variables with, for instance, literal values. Let me show you in a little bit higher resolution what this iterative scooping process looks like. So first, I select a line of code of interest, and then I click Scoop. Then the editor pulls up an extra pane where a snippet starts to get developed. And you can see all of the places where I have unresolved code, where I might have to select additional code, those are highlighted in red in the snippet that's being built up. I can click on any of those errors in order to resolve them. In this case, if I click on the cursor, then CodeScoop helps me select more code in order to complete the snippet. In this case, you can see It highlights the line of code that I can include from the original source program in the snippet, pointing me to just the relevant parts of the file that I should be considering. The way that it finds these lines is through something called static data flow analysis, which is just a method of finding which lines in a program depend on which other lines. So I'll include this line of code. And then what CodeScoop does is it starts recommending optional code that I might have forgotten. For instance, a for structure, a while structure, an if structure, all of which wrapped the code that I've just included. Most of those control structures I'll ignore, but this try catch block I'll include because I think that it's pedagogically useful in this snippet. It also recommends other uses of the variables that might change the meanings of those variables. And I can go through and review those one by one, making sure that I'm not overlooking anything from the original program. I can also simplify parts of the code. So for this column index title variable, I can replace it with a literal value. Where do these literal values come from? Well, when CodeScoop starts the scooping process, it runs the original source program and collects the literal values of all of the variables within the program, and then it makes them available within these lightweight menus. So here I'll replace this column index with the literal value 1 that it took on during program execution. I'll make a couple of other edits, replacing query with the actual query string, including the definition of the database variable. And then with this very last action, you'll see CodeScoop adds a bunch of extra lines at the very top. Those are import statements, and those are automatically included because there's really no authoring choice to be made there. An author is very likely to want to include those anyway, so CodeScoop just grabs them. So that was a lot of individual steps of the process, but you can essentially boil down the whole scooping interaction to having 4 basic steps. Along the lines of helping an author select code, they make these first selections, and then they fix up those selections with additional selections. They review these optional selections like the control structures and variable uses, and then simplifications occur throughout the process, for instance, substituting variables with literal values. And of course, there can be many other types of simplifications that one day become a part of scooping tools that we haven't yet prototyped. These are the ones that are just in the current version of the tool. So as I mentioned, in each of these projects, we developed new interactions, came up with the program analyses to support them, and then studied how they affected the authoring experience. The program analyses that support CodeScoop are of several different types. In order to help authors select code, we use static data flow analysis to detect which lines depend on which other lines. In order to help authors simplify their code, we collect execution traces while the program is executed to provide literal values that can be included. We use the Java Reflections API in order to detect what imports are necessary from the original program to be included into the sample program. And then we use parse tree walkers throughout the entire process in order to be able to find the fine-grained locations of all of the tokens in the program so that we can add those slick little highlights in very precise places within the code editor. So that's CodeScoop, that's how it's built. Does it lead to a more efficient and flexible authoring experience? We had these questions, and so we designed a pilot study where we invited 19 undergraduate student programmers to the lab, and we asked them to extract snippets from existing code, both with CodeScoop and a baseline text editor that was essentially the same, except without this whole dialogue and selection and simplification support. We had them extract snippets with both of these tools. What we ended up finding out was that CodeScoop versus the baseline was faster to use. They reported that it was easier to use and more enjoyable to use. And they were also more satisfied with the samples that they produced with CodeScoop than with the baseline text editor. Why might that be? In the words of one of the participants, CodeScoop's features made creating an example a lot easier because I just had to look at the relevant code and see if I needed it or not, instead of having to manually add them in. CodeScoop reduces the set of choices that an author has to make to a set of these smaller dialogues that they can interact with one at a time through the process of fleshing out the snippet. To give you a sense of what those decisions looked like and what the automated support looked like, we observed that through the snippet extraction task, CodeScoop made a median of 12 automated corrections, and then authors made a median of 5 choices about optional code to include, and 2 choices about whether or not, about the best way to fix exceptions and errors in the code. To give you a sense of some of the power that simplifications can have in CodeScoop, I want to show you an example of a snippet created both with an automated tool and with CodeScoop. So for task 3, participants consistently were capable of producing a scoop that was shorter than a conservative slice would have been. The slice would have been 101 lines long, and the scoop was 36 lines long, because most of the participants recognized that there was a line in that code that depended on a whole bunch of other structure in the program, that if you replaced it with a literal value, the snippet would have the same would have the same semantics, it would convey the same information, but with much less code. We observed that authors had a great, authors made use of the flexibility that CodeScoop provided. So here's a chart that shows the different types of decisions that were made about each of the variables that were unresolved within the snippet that an author was extracting. So in each of these cases, the colors, the colored blocks and numbers refer to different authors. And in each of the cases, they could have chosen to either select more code or insert a literal in place of that variable. And what you can see is that for each of these variables, for almost all of the variables, whenever there was a choice that could be made in one direction or another, authors picked both directions. You can also see some patterns, like some of these authors appear to be selectors and some of them appear to be simplifiers. For instance, 3 always added in code, and 5, well, actually 5 seemed to simplify a little bit of the time and select a little bit of the time. To give you a sense of what it looked like to produce a scoop in a couple of different ways, here are 2 different scoops produced from the same source program. The scoop on the left includes guard logic and exception handling logic. The one on the right doesn't, but it also includes the definitions of a bunch of the variables that were used in the program because the author believed that including the declarations of each of these variables with their names instead of the literal values provided additional semantic value to the snippet. Our takeaways from this study was that scooping was efficient compared to the baseline text editor, and that scooping provided flexibility in influencing the appearance of snippets, despite the fact that we were only providing a relatively limited set of selection and simplification capabilities. So now that we've talked about the case of producing these short snippets from existing source programs, let's get one step closer to helping people be able to produce something like this Mario tutorial. The Torii project is about helping authors produce programming tutorials from existing programs by helping them supplement the code and sequence it. Like in the CodeScoop study, we wanted to better understand what the authoring task of putting together tutorials looked like and ways in which tools could provide support. So we conducted 2 formative studies. First, we performed a content analysis of 200 programming tutorials collected from across the web on a variety of languages, but on a variety of topics. These were all widely referenced tutorials, so we inferred that they were probably relatively popular and used a fair amount. Each of these tutorials was analyzed according to 23 different dimensions in order to code different qualities of their content, structure, and format. What we ended up finding out was that these tutorials are essentially these tangled webs of relationships between snippets and outputs. For the snippets, we observed that most of the tutorials included fragments that if a programmer was to just copy and paste into a file editor and try to compile and run, they would not run on their own. We also found that code was often duplicated across snippets. One example of when this might come up is if an author shows the same piece of code a second time all on its own to describe it on its own. The tutorials also included rewritten code, where code that appeared at one place in a tutorial would be revised later on as the code was being further developed. We also observed that 2/3 of these tutorials included outputs that were generated from the snippets in that tutorial. These included both console outputs that would be produced by print statements, as well as images of outputs like screenshots. Also included videos, live demos, and places where users could tinker around with the code and see the outputs update live. What this means is that there are these software engineering challenges to producing programming tutorials that just aren't really documented in the research literature. In splitting these code, splitting up these programs into these different fragments, all of which are related to each other. To get a better sense of what it looked like to actually produce one of these tutorials, we interviewed 12 accomplished authors of programming tutorials. Each of these authors had written between a few and up to even a couple hundred of tutorials. We reached out to programmers from well-known blogs who had recent experience in producing these programming tutorials. And we found out a lot of interesting things through these studies, but one observation in particular that I want to focus on is that the act of sequencing code and splitting it into these snippets ends up yielding these parallel views of the code that will need to be maintained together. So when I start with a source program and I start creating a tutorial out of it, I might copy code from that source program into the tutorial. That code, like I mentioned before, might be duplicated within that same tutorial. Outputs are generated from those snippets. And then there's one more type of dependency in this workspace that I haven't yet talked about, which is these source programs also use languages and APIs that might change over time. So whenever a programmer wants to change one of these elements, the source program, or maybe the language or the API changes, or they want to change something in the snippet, they'll also need to change the remainder of the items in their workspace. Authors kept their parallel views consistent with each other using proactive approaches, where, for instance, they would start with a stable reference implementation that they would be pretty sure they would never want to change before starting to break it into snippets. They also used version control in clever ways in order to be able to propagate edits that they made from one step to many other steps. They also had a handful of corrective approaches, for instance, playtesting their own tutorials to make sure they indeed were capable of producing the same outputs after you followed through with them. What we realized from these conversations with authors and these analyses of existing programming tutorials was that we might be able to improve the experience of tutorial authoring by providing new ways of sequencing and supplementing code. So let's say you have a source program that you're creating a tutorial for. What if the code editor was capable of detecting links between the source program and the snippets that are in that tutorial? And as I change some of the code in the snippet, it propagates back to the source program. And as I change it in the source program, it propagates to the snippet. And then what if for the outputs in a tutorial, the tool could understand how to automatically regenerate these as any of the code in the workspace changed? And one way that you might be able to do this is if you pay attention to the order in which the snippets in the tutorial appeared in the original source program, maybe what you could do is just take out those snippets, reorder them in the order they appeared in the original source program, run those snippets, get the output, and then embed that output into the tutorial, allowing an author to arrange the snippets in any order that they want, but still allowing these outputs to always be consistent with the snippets by design. We embodied this idea in a new tool that we called Torii. So similar to CodeScoop, you can see there's a source program in the left pane, and in the right pane, there's going to be a tutorial. We called this tool Torii because Torii is kind of an extracted form of the word tutorial. A Torii is also a gateway from the mundane to the spiritual, just like our tool elevates mundane source programs into this spiritual realm where edits can be automatically propagated across source program snippets and outputs. So how does Torii work? Throughout this demo of Torii, you're going to see in this right ribbon, I'm going to include a bunch of different pieces of functionality that are related to supplementing and sequencing code. So the first of these is rich text. Torii allows me to add text to the tutorial with that add text button that can be rich and formatted, where I can explain the steps of the tutorial. Second, I can add snippets by selecting code from the original source program and then clicking add snippet. And what's special about this snippet is that it supports linked edits. So as I edit the original source program, you can see the edits propagate back to the original snippet and vice versa, keeping the snippet and the source program consistent with each other. I'll go ahead and add a couple of other explanations and a couple other snippets to this tutorial. And then the next step is to add an output. I can add an output by clicking Add Output beneath any of the snippets in the tutorial. And there's something magical that just happened in the addition of this output to the tutorial. Specifically, if you look at the snippets that appear above the output, they're actually in an invalid order. If you were to execute them in this order, they would cause an error because there's a usage of a class before its declaration. But Torii still figures out how to generate this output because it takes these snippets and then it reorders them in the order that they appeared in the original source program before trying to generate the output. This is the major source of flexibility that Torii provides in how to organize tutorials and the snippets within them. Torii also enables a couple of other forms of flexibility. For instance, code can be repeated in multiple places within the tutorial. In this case, perhaps I want to show these 2 lines in context first, and then I want to show them on their own when I'm explaining them in further detail. Torii only includes them once when it's generating the outputs. I can also fragment the code. For instance, I can, this def area function belongs within a class, but I can split up the code in such a way that it's only shown on its own within the tutorial. And as long as the class declaration line shows somewhere within the tutorial, Torii's going to be able to figure out how to generate the outputs correctly. Torii also allows me to hide snippets that I don't think should be visible to the reader of the tutorial because they might be distracting, but which I think are important to the computation of the outputs. So I just hid this one snippet. And as I add other snippets and outputs to the tutorial, you can see that the definition of square that I just used, that I just hid, is still used in the computation of those outputs. So in summary, Torii supports the simultaneous supplementing and sequencing of code, where the supplementing occurs through the addition of these rich text explanations and these outputs. And the sequencing is in the production of these snippets and the linking of edits across all of the snippets, outputs, and source programs within the workspace. So we've just talked about the interactions. Let's talk about the program analysis. The main program analysis that supports this tool is a refinement to the idea of linked editing from human-centered software development tools, where edits can propagate across software clones. Where basically we just provide another model of linked editing where edits propagate from source programs to snippets, and where they can also propagate to outputs by assembling the snippets in the original order that they appeared in the source program. We evaluated Torii to be able to understand whether it supported efficient editing of tutorials and whether it supported flexible organization of snippets. We conducted an in-lab study where we invited 12 programmers with tutorial authoring experience to the lab. We asked them to perform a couple of tutorial editing tasks where they made modifications to existing tutorials, both with Torii and with a baseline tool. And then we also had them undertake an exploratory task where we provided them with a source program and asked them to create a tutorial out of it. We observed the efficiency of editing tasks by measuring the time that it took authors to perform certain small editing tasks to tutorials. I'm not going to focus on subtask B and C because they relate to features that I did not describe in the demo. These comparisons compare the timing that it took in order to perform these edit operations with the comparison tool and with Torii. And the first subtask was linked editing, where an author was asked to make a change to somewhere in the code and then make sure that it was consistent with all of the outputs and other appearances of that code. What we observed was that there was a tendency for the task to be completed more quickly with Torii than with the comparison tool. With the other subtasks, which we won't really talk about, these ones appear to require a little bit more practice, required a little bit of restructuring of authors' mental models. Our main takeaway from these efficiency measurements is that it was clear that participants were capable of using Torii in order to make these edits. And there's just not enough evidence with the 12 participants that we included in the current study to claim that they make the experience more efficient at this time. However, we did observe patterns where there was flexible authoring of these tutorials with the capabilities that the system provided. So here's a snippet that one of the participants produced, split into 2 panes. And you can see that there's a couple of cool patterns in this tutorial. First, code was split into these fragments of code that wouldn't have been able to be executed on their own. In this case, there's a class declaration and a method declaration. The same code was repeated multiple times. The second time for this init function, it was embellished. It embellished on the definition that was shown the first time around. And of course, Torii figured out to only include the repeated code once before generating the outputs. This author decided to hide some of the code in the tutorial that they didn't want the reader to see, but they still wanted to be part of the execution. And of course, there were outputs that were generated from this mishmash of snippets that were shown in this very flexibly organized way. Looking across all of the participants, we observed several patterns come up across the tutorials that they produced. And again, this is over the course of 15 to 30 minutes or so with these relatively simple source programs. So we were excited to see them already starting to employ these capabilities in such a short time. 6 out of 12 of them repeated the same code twice in different parts of the tutorial. One of them ordered snippets out of the order that they would have to be executed for it to be syntactically correct in the program. And 3 of them fragmented the code into small snippets that wouldn't have been able to stand on their own without a body. For instance, splitting up the declaration of and implementation of a class or a method. Our takeaways from the study with Torii is that authors were capable of performing linked edits more quickly with Torii than with a baseline tool, though this isn't statistically significant. We also observed that authors were capable of using Torii's capabilities to flexibly organize the snippets in a tutorial, even with relatively short training experience and short authoring tasks. So across the tools that we've explored so far, both CodeScoop and Torii have shown us how you can design these interactions that support selecting, simplifying, supplementing, and sequencing code. I want to talk about a third tool called gathering tools. And the motivation behind gathering tools is that there's this type of code editor called a computational notebook that has recently become very popular, and it's also notorious for creating messy programs where distillation can really satisfy a sore need. In particular, gathering tools provides functionality for helping authors select code from these messy notebooks, as well as supplement them with the outputs and results from those notebooks. For those of you who have never used a computational notebook before, let me explain to you why it becomes messy. So the notebook model of exploratory programming is that I can incrementally execute a few lines of code at a time. So I'll write code in these small blocks called cells, and I'll execute each of those code blocks one at a time. I can add in situ outputs to the notebook, executing a line of code, and then it'll show the print output from it. I'll also show, here's a scatter plot that's produced from some of the data that I've loaded into the notebook. And again, as I execute this code, the results from them get embedded right next to the code. I can also make incremental changes to the code. So here I'm changing the number of clusters in my clustering algorithm and then regenerating the scatter plot based on it. And notebooks allow me to just change little bits of the code and rerun just those lines one at a time. Finally, it provides me with some level of control over layout. So for instance, I could bring these cells to the top of the notebook if I'm about to share it with someone else and I want to highlight those results. Of course, this isn't the level of control over layout that Torii provides, but it is some. The challenge with computational notebooks comes when a week passes and I haven't looked at this notebook and I decide all of a sudden I would like to clean up this notebook and share it with someone else, where I have 3 questions that end up all of a sudden becoming very difficult to answer. The first one is, how did I produce this result? And it turns out that in computational notebooks, sometimes the surface presentation of the notebook isn't enough for you to be able to determine what combination of cells were used in order to produce a result. And you can even delete some of the lines of code that were used to produce a result, making it impossible to find out how that result was produced. If I'm sharing this code with others, I might also ask, didn't I have a better version of this? There might be another version of this plot that I wish to share. And if I want to remove cells from this notebook in order to clean it, I might have this question of what can I get rid of? We call the types of messes that arise in computational notebooks disappearance of code, disorder of code, and dispersion of code. And over the course of the last few years at CHI and other conferences in human-computer interaction, it's been well documented that notebooks frequently become messy and hard to use as exploratory programming goes, as exploratory programming proceeds. So we designed code gathering tools as a type of distillation tool to help authors be able to clean up their messy notebooks. So once 1 week has passed for this author and they want to clean up this notebook, and they have the question, how did I produce this? The first thing they'll see when code gathering tools is enabled is that all of the variables and results in the notebook are highlighted in blue. And if I want to gather the code up that produced any of these results, I can just click on that result. And you can see the lines that were used to produce it get highlighted in purple. And then I can click on this button, Gather to Notebook. And what's extracted is gathered code, a set of the cells from the original notebook that are reduced, ordered, and complete. And this includes cells that might have been deleted from the notebook in order to produce this result. And if I rerun this notebook, you can see that it indeed reproduces the original result. I might have this question of, didn't I have a better version of this result that maybe I want to share? And in this case, with code gathering tools, I can click on the result. I can click on Gather to Revisions. And then a version browser opens up, which shows the results side by side along with timestamps for when they were generated. It shows the ordered reduced a subset of cells that produced each of these results with line by line diffs that compare the code that was in those cells at the different, to produce the different versions of the results. And for any of them, you can see there are these buttons that would allow me to open it up in a cleaned notebook or to copy a subset, an ordered subset of cells to continue using in my own exploratory programming. In order to answer this question, what code can I get rid of? I can just click on any of these results, and anything that is not highlighted in purple in the notebook wasn't used to produce this result and should be fair game to delete. These are the ways in which code gathering tools serve as a means of distilling existing notebooks. The program analysis that supports code gathering tools is, once again, program slicing, but it's a different variant on program slicing. We can't just slice a computational notebook because, like I mentioned, some cells might be missing and cells might be out of order, which makes it difficult to detect which lines depend on which other lines. So we make use of a parallel representation of the notebook, which is the execution log. Every time that a cell is executed, we append it to an invisible log that the user can't see. And then when it comes time to extract out a simplified version of the notebook based on a result that's selected, we perform a backward slice on the cell that produced that result and find all of the cells, all of the lines in the execution log that are necessary to producing that result. And then we present those, we package up that slice into a set of well-formatted cells that can then be turned into a notebook or viewed in one of these version browsers. And of course, one could imagine that if you have an imprecise slicer, maybe you could even in the future employ something like scooping in order to make selection more precise. So when we are evaluating code gathering tools, the one question that I want to cover here is the question of how do data and analysts distill code during the process of exploratory data analysis? We invited 12 professional data analysts to the lab, and we had them both clean existing notebooks and do exploratory data analysis with code gathering tools enabled. Participants really liked this tool. They described the functionality of being able to gather to a notebook as beautiful and amazing and said that it hits the nail on the head. These analysts were really experiencing lots of problems with messes in their computational notebooks, where this tool provided a simple, accessible way of being able to clean up those notebooks. And we saw flexibility in the ways that authors were employing gathering tools in order to distill their notebooks. So some of them distilled their notebooks as what they called finishing moves of cleaning it up at the end of exploration. Some of them gathered the code in multiple different ways for different audiences. For instance, collecting some of the results for one potential audience and collecting just the code for another potential audience. Some of them created personal references for themselves. And so with these very lightweight, just a couple of clicks interactions for distilling code, we were already seeing flexible ways in which those tools could be used to support the task of exploratory data analysis and all of the many little distillation needs that are needed throughout exploratory data analysis. We also learned about new needs that authors might have for distilling notebooks. So while many of these authors described their existing practices in cleaning notebooks as involving picking a subset of cells and removing the rest, we also learned that it involves many additional stages, things like writing documentation, polishing visualizations, merging code, restructuring code, and integrating with version control. And future distillation tools might be able to help with each of these different tasks. Our main takeaways from this study with code gathering tools was that the tools can be picked up quickly and readily applied to new use cases and notebooks. And they also cover an important yet incomplete set of tasks for distilling notebooks. And there are plenty of opportunities for further exploring distillation tools in this ecosystem. We ended up packaging up distillation code gathering tools as an extension to the Jupyter Lab environment. If you want to play around with it and let us know what you think, you can run this command if you have Jupyter Lab installed to play around with it. One thing that was pretty exciting last summer was there was a small project within VS Code to enable Gather as an experimental feature within VS Code. There's been just a lot of excitement around this feature, and we're interested to see if interactions like this may one day be adopted into notebooks. So, having gone over those three projects, let's revisit the thesis of this work, that authors can transform existing programs into sample programs more efficiently and flexibly when aided by interactive tools for selecting, simplifying, supplementing, and sequencing code. The three claims that I mentioned before were that these distillation tools can provide these new interactions for these four tasks, that they can be supported by existing program analyses, and that they can support more efficient, flexible authoring experiences. We've shown that these tools indeed can provide these interactive capabilities, and that they're supported by the program analyses of program slicing and linked editing and dynamic analysis. And then also, in the case of CodeScoop, they led to more efficient authoring. And in the case of CodeScoop, code gathering tools, and Torii, they all led to a certain amount of flexibility in authoring that wouldn't be present in standard tools that authors might otherwise have available. All of this work is just a special case of this more general question of how do we help authors create more effective instructions? And so looking forward with distillation tools, how could we make distillation tools to just help authors more effectively create effective instructions? One visual aid for answering this question is this design space of distillation tools. So my dissertation is about to get submitted. From chapter 3, it includes this one figure, and the text is way too small to see here, so let me blow up part of it. This is a portion of the design space where the purpose of the design space is to plot out all of the different ways in which distillation tools can provide capabilities for distilling programs. For helping authors sequence programs, for instance, they can help an author make anywhere from 1 to hundreds or thousands of versions of the same program. And they can support linked editing between source programs, snippets, outputs, and maybe even someday explanations. Throughout the process of this dissertation, we filled in a large amount of this design space. So the three different colors that you can see here are for the three different tools that we explained. But there's also a lot of white space that hasn't yet been explored that would make really interesting areas for future work. Three of them that I'm particularly excited about is, for instance, thinking about maybe using mixed initiative program synthesis to help authors simplify programs by allowing them to take out big chunks of those programs and automatically synthesizing simpler replacements that can be shimmed in their place. natural language generation in order to produce better explanations, and perhaps you can even establish links between the text in a tutorial and the code, that as you edited one of them, the edits would propagate to the other one. And the third one is the design of explorable tutorials. Let me explain this one a little bit more. So this is an explorable tutorial from the React Native documentation. And the explorable aspect of it is that I can change the border color, the border width in this example, and the output that's shown right next to it updates live. I can change some of the text. I can change the dimensions of this cat picture that shows up in this output. A lot of the authors in our interviews with tutorial authors wanted functionality like this within their tutorials. Of course, this leads to a couple of questions. First, what are effective patterns for creating these explorables in the first place? Would users actually make use of these interactive affordances? And what are the ways that you can perhaps even constrain the space of exploration to make learning more effective? There are also technical questions about how you can build tools that enable the creation of these explorables, because not all languages will necessarily be easy to re-execute code for within the browser. So maybe you could simulate a bit of the exploration ahead of time, and you can embed it in the tutorial. There's a bunch of technical questions to be asked and answered in order to help authors make explorable tutorials. One other area that I'm interested in is the distillation of scientific discourse. So if you squint at this academic paper, you can see that there are some superficial traits that make it look kind of like a program. It has a bunch of cryptic notation in it, and there are these logical dependencies between different parts of that paper. Would it be possible to help an author distill down this paper to a more simpler form that could be shared with others? So this is actually the epilogue to my PhD, in that this upcoming year, I'll be continuing on with a postdoc with one of my advisors, Marty, on this project that's a collaboration between Berkeley and AI2, which intersects with this question of, can we help with the distillation of scientific discourse? Pretty soon, my dissertation is going to be published, and if you're interested in this work, you should check out, there might be a couple of chapters that you'd be interested in checking out. Chapter 2 is a background about how programmers read, use, write, and should write sample programs. And Chapter 3 introduces this large base of distillation tools and decades of history on tools for presenting programs as they relate to that larger space. So I want to conclude this talk by taking a chance to thank my mentors and collaborators. I want to start by thanking Bjorn and Marty, who are my two mentors and have been for the last 5.5 years. I started working with Bjorn when I first came to Berkeley, and I don't think that there's ever been a time when Bjorn's office door hasn't been open when I've really needed it. I don't think that there's been a time that I haven't left Bjorn's office feeling better than when I entered it. Marty has come along for the ride of this PhD. We brought her on when we initially thought that we were working on search user interfaces. After 3 months, we decided we were no longer doing that. And we have been so lucky to have Marty as one of the leaders on these projects ever since. Any precise wording that I have in these papers, I think that we can attribute to the feedback that Marty has given. And she's just been amazing at helping define many of the studies that we run in this dissertation, and so many of the revisions that ended up making this work stronger. And of course, Marty is also who will be working on this distillation of scientific discourse project with. This project also joins together contributions of many different people, and these are just the people on the 3 projects that I've described here. I've been very lucky to get the mentorship, support, and ideas of many people from Berkeley, Microsoft, Google, Microsoft Research, Google, and AI2, and I'm very thankful for that. So with that, I'd like to conclude and welcome any questions. If people have questions, we've got this chat box. I can see that it's been populating, so we might have some fun things to talk about. Officially, we're on the calendar through 11:15. I can stick around for a bit longer after that for a bit more of a kind of informal debriefing.